Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture 32, Indigenous Methodologies. First, I want to try to frame this subject by talking about ways that people have tried to avoid Western modes of understanding in general. And then I want to look in particular at two key concepts in the understanding and representation of Indigenous methodology, which are research and methodology. First, ways of avoiding Western kinds of understanding. So the globalization of art writing has been increasing around the world. For many kinds of art writing, including art history, art criticism, art theory, there are certain forms that are expected. So for example, the length of the publication, blog length, book length, the kind of narrative that's expected, biographical, journalistic, scholarly in different ways, the concepts that are deployed, words like space, form, affect, materiality, performativity, the language in which it's written, mainly and of course problematically English with just a few words from other languages, the venues where the research is shown, or the work, the artwork, art fairs, galleries, journals, blogs, the points of reference that are cited in the work, what counts as a known artist or a movement, and the methodologies, whether the work should use formal analysis, or whether there are other models, including research, that I'll get to in the second and third parts of this talk. There's a contrast between that kind of increasing uniformity, homogenization, and globalization of the writing. There's a contrast between that and the diversity of art practice, because at the same time, art practices are becoming even more diverse and more inclusive. So there's every year art shown from quote-unquote new places, not known to the public, that's seeing it, like from Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and a couple of recent examples. Artists who identify as mixed, trans, or post-national will find voices in ways that they haven't before. Art from quote-unquote new makers, rural quilters, now widely part of the art world, part of the art market. Outsider artists since the early 20th century. Artists of color and non-cis identifying artists in all sorts of contexts. So this contrast between the uniformity of writing and the diversity of practice has produced a kind of crisis in representation. How should artists be represented and described in and for the art world? I want to just look for a minute at what's happening in this regard to this question outside the art world. Because these issues that art history has been looking at for the last 10 or 15 years have been widely studied in other disciplines, especially anthropology, ethnography, but also sociology, political theory, economics, and history in general. Those fields have been developing different accounts about how people from the developed world can best understand or represent people from other cultures. In economics, for example, that means understanding non-capitalist systems and trying to provide aid without imposing capitalist ideas. This book, The Post-Development Reader, is a fairly depressing example of that. The authors conclude that the concept of, quote, development has become a deceitful mirage, fostering division, exclusion, and discrimination rather than liberation of any kind. They say, quote, development schemes ultimately served expansionist post-colonial developers and ignored indigenous values. There's a good review of this book by Peter Oakley, in which he says it's still an unsolved problem despite the efforts of many subversive, human-centered, and radical workers. Now, before I look at research and methodology in particular, I want to note that indigeneity itself is a politically vexed term. That's, in the first instance, because some countries don't recognize the existence of indigenous peoples because that would involve acknowledging colonialism. The blue water or saltwater criterion, as it's called, holds, for example, that if people did not arrive in a place after crossing water, there can be no settler populations, and therefore no separate indigenous populations. In other cases, people have rejected claims of indigeneity on their own behalf in order to claim nationhood. That's happened, for example, in the Tibet movement. So the very act of acknowledging or naming indigenous peoples as indigenous is already a political one. There's a very good essay on this subject called Welcome to the Year of Unindigenous Languages. on to the second subject, research. A principal target of people who theorize indigenous methodologies is this concept of research. It's ubiquitous in the art world, all the way from the first year of art instruction, all the way up through the PhD, the practice-led PhD. There's another lecture on that, on the concept of artistic research. And it's fundamental to many of the fields that study indigenous cultures outside the art world. Linda Tuahali Smith's book that you see on the right is one of the most influential in this critique of research. She teaches in New Zealand, and she's affiliated with two Maori tribes, Ngati Awa and Ngati Porou. For her, the models of research are all colonial and imperialist. Research is usually said to need consistent, defensible methodologies, which I'll talk about in a minute. Defined hypotheses, in other words, you have to say what it is that you hope to achieve with your scholarly or your art project. Defined bodies of evidence, you have to say what your archive is, what counts for you as evidence and what doesn't count as evidence. A commitment to publication, to join the institutional apparatus. An involvement in disciplines and professionalism. Standards of empiricism, logic, and argument, and rigor, strong constraints on what counts as argument, and constraints on things that are not argument, like impressionistic description and things like that. And accessibility, that is to say, your work has to be able to be evaluated or assessed, because that's what makes it comparable to other researchers' work. All of this, of course, based on a scientific model. That's where the idea of research comes from, even though it's been transformed a lot in its various uses in the art world. Here's another way of considering research by a scholar who's Sami and Maori, Russian-Norwegian Sami ethnographer named Jelena Porsanger. She says, in the Western understanding, research in general may be defined as an investigation or experiment aimed at the discovery and interpretation of facts. Research includes collecting information about a particular subject, revising accepted theories or laws in the light of new facts, and the practical application of such new or revised theories or laws. And then down at the bottom, she says, in relation to indigenous peoples, their entire existence seems to be a problem or a question for researchers, often formulated as, quote, the, insert name of indigenous group, problem, or the, insert name of indigenous group, question. This is a difficult problem for art because elements of research are built into the curriculum. Here is an example from my own institution of the first year studio art required class called the Research Studio. The learning outcomes here are listed, and the first of them is practice and research. And this same emphasis on research exists in varying degrees through all levels, all the way up through the PhD. One solution is to answer the colonial and post-colonial research with story work, with narration. That would be collaborative, community-based exchanges of information and ideas that avoid defined protocols of Western academic research. A second solution is to define some elements of indigenous knowledge as research. And Smith does this by privileging Kaupapa Maori indigenous strategies. There's part of her list at the right, where you can see things like the principle of culturally preferred pedagogy, the principle of extended family structure. In other words, rethinking indigenous categories so that they can appear as research. It's often been difficult to persuade academic institutions to accept ideas like these in place of research, even if research is now widely recognized as colonial, Western European, cold, bound up with power, fundamentally scientific, inappropriate to the arts, and so on. And that's because academic institutions, mostly universities, but including art schools, academies, and art departments, they continue to value, or at least to need, the rigor and standardization and comparability that's offered by research, simply, or if only, because they need to be accredited and their departments need to be compared with other departments, and they need to have learning outcomes. All of the funding decisions in universities will depend on things like that. It's the entire framework that gives the structure to the institution itself, even if the content of it is increasingly at odds with those ideals. As an example of the difficulty of completely relinquishing research, Simon Priest is a Canadian educator. He is very interested in Indigenous and Aboriginal work, but he's also very committed to research. His blog describes his encounter with Indigenous cultures on several continents and his conversations with Linda Tuahali Smith. There's his diagram of the research pyramid. It's a typical kind of schematization or standardization of the steps or stages of research, which can also be found in the scientific models from which all of this ultimately derives. He uses at one point a turtle shell to illustrate 13 principles of IA work, many of which have been adopted by other scholars. So at the center there is community empowerment and autonomy, because empathy and empowerment are essential starting points in the representation of Indigenous voices. And then around it, the other parts of the shell are the elements that are that go into what counts as Indigenous or Aboriginal, in this case, IA work. And they are all community-based and collaborative. So there's no hierarchy here. However, after he does that, he also describes his experiences representing this work, or it needs to be represented to the outside world in its various more or less uniform shapes and forms, like I showed in the first couple slides. Then it's necessary to go back to producing rigorous and accessible empirical research schemata, like the one on the left, where you have a flow chart from contract, diagnose, design, deliver, debrief, depart, and improve, and then repeat along the right margin. The other major concept that's involved in the problematics of giving voice to Indigenous interests is methodology. There is a large literature on Indigenous methodologies. That word is often used instead of research to indicate strategies and meanings that can be communicated, but that lack the formal elements of research. The word methodologies in this context remains problematic because methodologies are a traditional crucial element of research. Margaret Kovach is an Indigenous scholar working in Canada. Her background is Saulteaux, which is Canadian First Nation, also known as Plains Ojibwe, and Plains Cree, and she was raised by a Hungarian family on a farm in Saskatchewan. This book, Indigenous Methodologies, Characteristics, Conversations, and Contexts, focuses on a couple of strategies to resist erasure and accommodate intercultural dialogue. First, augmenting the, quote, findings of others by extended interviews and meditations. So resisting the forms of writing favored by disciplines like anthropology. Second, focusing on her people's epistemic center, their core of knowledge and experience, and speaking from there. So this is a way of avoiding some problematic concepts in methodology and research, and also producing writing as a result which doesn't conform to some of those norms on the first bullet point list that I had at the beginning of this lecture. Jelena Porsanger sets out an argument for framing the study of Indigenous methodologies by always asking whom they benefit and how they will go out into the world. Will they be publications? Will they support someone's professional career? Will they benefit some political policy? On the right there is an excerpt from her text, and down at the bottom you see some of the questions. Whose research is this? Who owns it? Whose interest does it serve? This is also following Smith's book. It could be argued that this doesn't resolve the meaning of methodologies or even define something different from research, but it certainly changes the conversation to questions of power and purpose. The art world is especially open, I think, in many of its institutions to different kinds of meaning, especially representations that use visual storytelling and video to move outside the conventions of explanatory research narratives. There's an example on the right of a dissertation from 2017, which, as you can see from the title, involves visual storytelling, filmmaking, and so on. These things are increasingly accepted at universities, but the art world and art teaching contexts like art academies and art schools have long been particularly open to these possibilities. There can be room for this kind of thing, for conversation, for empathy and empowerment, but it's always important to remember that these spaces, as free as they are balanced by, actually contained in, institutions that have curricular and administrative interests in standardization and comparability, because that's what allows them to remain accredited, and that's what allows them to attract students and donors and so on. So this is not an easy subject. It's not easy to reconcile these different voices of Indigenous artists, Indigenous voices in general on the one hand, and their representation to the world, or just to the academy or to the art world on the other.